And we're live. We're live, guys. Welcome to another episode of Good Morning Liberty. Happy Friday. It is October the 12th, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. My name is Michael Boldin, broadcasting here from my home studio, live on the West Coast in downtown Los Angeles. That's the 10th Amendment Center. This is our home office. It's a spare bedroom, so we are as grassroots as can be. I really appreciate you joining me here today, and I hope your Friday is off to a good start, or maybe it's the afternoon or evening, whenever you happen to be watching. Hello over to Aviator Tom and a Woodsider over in the live chat. Thank you for being here. And if you're watching and not leaving comments, hi as well. And of course, let's get right to the reminders. First of all, smash those likes if you like this show and you want to see us spread the word. Help us spread the word. Smash those likes. It helps trigger the algorithm over at whatever social network you're on, if it's here on YouTube or elsewhere. That tells them to spread the word. And as long as we're continuing to be on places like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, we're going to keep posting. We're going to reach as many people as we can while they allow us to be there. I assume eventually we'll get booted from all those platforms over time for advocating that people nullify basically everything. So we're going to keep doing that, but we're also trying to build alternative resources, our platform or our support on other platforms. For example, we are on BitChute and Reel.video, where we cross-post our videos. Every time we post one here on YouTube, we will post them later in the day on those channels. And then we are also on places like Minds.com. I've had a number of people, we actually recommended Minds.com on both our Facebook and Twitter profiles last night. I had a number of people recommend Gab.ai. And we are on Gab, but we were basically testing out a couple of social networks, kind of a Facebook/Twitter alternative, just to kind of build those. So when we get booted eventually from Facebook, if we do, that we've already got an established following elsewhere. So I was spending some time doing both, and I noticed that we were just getting a lot more engagement on Minds.com. Maybe the content we post is much more friendly to that network than the other. So I haven't been aggressively pushing Gab.ai, but if a lot of people really want us to do it, I will put a little bit more time into it. Maybe not post as often. We're doing generally 2 posts a day on Minds.com, probably 3 to 4 on Facebook, more than that on Twitter. Maybe I can do 1 a day over on Gab just to keep things going and keep it consistent. So thank you, everyone who left those recommendations. EHP training, absolutely right. Concordia res parve crescunt. I should do an entire episode on that phrase. It means in Latin, small things grow great by concord. So good reminder, because every small step that we take when other people join us build over time. So good reminder from EHP training. And then one other reminder, I should be doing this a little bit more often, but I haven't been. I've got a couple of events coming up that I'm speaking at. And I had stopped doing events for quite a while just because travel and taking time out to prep speeches and things like that was taking me away from the day-to-day functioning of managing the organization and our team and the website and things like that. And so I just kind of taken a break from doing much travel. And then I was invited by Tom Woods to do 2 awesome events last year. They were pretty much back-to-back. It was his 1,000th episode of his podcast, his celebration in Orlando, Florida last October. Maybe it was last August. And then that was followed up just a couple of weeks later by the Contra Cruise. Both of these events were incredible, and it kind of re-inspired me to start getting out with the community a little bit more. So I've done some more events recently. I've got a few coming up, one here in Los Angeles. And if I keep doing this, maybe I'll build an events page on the website. I know Mike Meharry does some events as well, so we should probably include his as well. So I'm doing a brunch hosted by Liberty on the Rocks, Republican Liberty Caucus of Los Angeles, plus Jason Stapleton and Lions of Liberty. We're doing a brunch in West Hollywood Sunday morning from 11 a.m. till 3 o'clock in the afternoon here on the West Coast. It's a free event, so myself and Jason Stapleton, who's an awesome podcaster, and he moved here to Los Angeles recently. I probably should be hanging out with him more often. And Brian McWilliams, who is part of the trio of Lions of Liberty. They're really, really good podcasters and fun people. So we're going to do that. And it's a free event. If you're in Southern California or you want to come hang out and you're kind of nearby, I'll make sure that the links are in the show notes. after we finish recording here, and you can just register and go for free. Then the following week, on Saturday, I'm participating in what's being called the largest secessionist conference in America. This is an event hosted by the Abbeville Institute, which is a pretty old organization. They promote radical decentralization and secession, generally more to, I guess, more of an academic approach or audience. And I was actually very, very glad to be asked by Don Livingston to come and speak about nullification. So I'm going to be giving a talk there in Dallas on November 10th about the state of the nullification movement. So I'm going to kind of give an overview of what we mean by nullification and then how it's going around the country. And I think it's actually, even though we're in the face of the largest government in the history of the world, I think it's going very well. You'll have to come to Dallas to hear why. So the revival of secession and state nullification. I'm there with Don Livingston, Dan Fisher, who was a candidate for governor in Oklahoma, Alan Mendenhall, Jeff Deist, head of the Mises Institute, who is a really, really great speaker and a really good guy, plus Kirkpatrick Sale. And Marcus Ruiz Evans, I believe, is the guy who's heading up the Cal exit. I'm not talking about secession. I don't really spend a lot of time on it because I think there are people better equipped to do that. And I work primarily on nullification. So it was good to see Don basically getting us all together to talk about different versions of radical decentralization as an approach to defeat the modern giant state and advance liberty. So I'll post links to those on the show notes, both in YouTube and then also at blog.10thamendmentcenter.com when we post the video in the next couple of hours after we finish recording today. But today I want to talk about, and let's get right into past the advertising and right into the discussion I want to have. And I was talking the other day, if you were watching the show, I was talking about the new bump stock ban from Donald Trump, pointing out that it is totally unconstitutional, it's awful, and that states should take action, as T.J. Martinell pointed out. We also cited some advice from James Madison and Judge Andrew Napolitano that states should opt out in the enforcement of federal gun control as a way to nullify it. And how do you get them to do it? Well, you introduce and pass into law what's called a Second Amendment Preservation Act to ban the use of resources or material support or personnel in the enforcement of federal gun control. And this is a very powerful way of doing it. Well, there are two general oppositions that we get from people who are friendly to the cause. Now, of course, you're going to have oppositions from people who say that, oh, well, gun control is good and you guys are evil for wanting to oppose it. But from people who are generally friendly to the cause, conservative or Republican gun rights activists will sometimes tell us, well, why do we need a bill to nullify the feds? They say basically, shouldn't states nullify federal actions that infringe on your natural rights simply based on the words of the Constitution? So that is one of the first things we hear from some quarters, that basically the Second Amendment already says shall not be infringed. So why would we need the states to do anything? This whole Second Amendment Preservation Act is a sham. You're marketing. We don't trust you, something like that. Now, the other opposition comes from the libertarian end of the spectrum, probably, and if you're familiar with the term, the ANCAP, the far libertarian, and more of the Rothbard world. And they generally cite, let me see if I can get this stupid pop-up out of the way. They cite a 19th century anarchist named Lysander Spooner. You can Google him if you don't know who he is, but he wrote a lot of really interesting stuff. Tried to run a parallel post office to undermine the federal one. So a pretty courageous guy. And he has this quote. We'll often hear this in response from the ANCAPs. But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. Now, in response to the conservative opposition that, well, the words on paper are already there, why do we need something? I think, to me, that's the easy one. I'm actually more in line. I guess I more understand why people gravitate towards the Spooner argument because, like, look how bad things are. The Constitution is supposed to be the greatest governing document in the history of the world, and yet things are awful. We have endless gun control, endless spending, asset forfeiture, mass surveillance, unconstitutional wars. Of course, the Constitution must suck. It did the wrong thing. And as Spooner pointed out, Spooner says, well, it's probably the fault. Either it was incapable of doing something or it caused the problems we have today. So, I mean, I see where people get this from. But let's go over a couple of things. And I'm primarily going to focus on the latter, although I guess I could comment a little bit more on the former, primarily in the fact that when we're talking about nullifying, we're talking about states changing their current status quo to undermine, to remove resources that are currently being used to help the federal government violate our rights. So currently today, the BATFE, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, our favorite corner market in some future society, they rely almost entirely. They've got about 5,100 agents for the entire country. A third of them are pencil pushers sitting at desks. They're in administration. So 3,700 enforcement, on-the-ground enforcement agents who have a capacity of about 8,000, 10,000 close cases per year. Well, every time they do an enforcement action, they call local law enforcement. Local law enforcement through what's known as MOAs or MOU, Memorandum of Agreement or Memorandum of Understanding. They sign these agreements that when the ATF calls them, they're going to help out. And we uncovered in an old video here, and I should have actually put this in my links. I'm just remembering as I'm talking about it. But we did a video here, I think 2 years ago, talking about how we actually pulled up these MOUs in a number of cities in Arizona. We did a video on one specifically where you can read the text. They basically say, okay, well, the city of blank, I forget who it was, is going to help the ATF when the ATF calls on them. And the ATF, if those officers do overtime, the ATF will pay them for the overtime. But what's ignored is that they're being paid by the city to enforce city and state laws, maybe just city if it's a home rule situation, but city or state, and they're spending time on the local dime to help enforce federal laws. And I should put laws in quotes because federal gun control isn't real. It doesn't rise to the level of law. So local law enforcement all across the country, and this is pervasive. It's not just on guns. It's on cannabis. It's on Obamacare. Environmental regulations from the federal government are almost solely enforced at the state level. So states are basically doing most of the enforcement work for the federal government. And then you have a few agents that kind of dictate how things are going to go from Washington, D.C. So they're basically helping the federal government. The locals are paying for it. This obfuscates who the source of the problem is. It obfuscates how the federal government can't pull this off. And then you don't know how much it's really costing to do these enforcement mechanisms. So if the ATF spends however many $1 billion a year, they're not even counting the amount of time that local law enforcement is doing basically on-duty work to help the federal agency do the enforcement. So legislation to say that this is not going to happen anymore, this is no longer allowed, is just a directive to say what you've been doing, stop. Now, this has been very effective on asset forfeiture. Asset forfeiture is a program whereby they basically charge property with a crime, and if you want to get it back, you have to prove its innocence. So government is stealing from people. If a cop pulls somebody over and they find too much cash in the back, that cop could theoretically say, well, I think that's drug money. I'm going to take it. I have reason to believe this is drug money. I'm going to take it. You don't get it back. And now you have to prove that it wasn't used in a crime. So it's totally opposite of the way the system's supposed to work. It's robbery. It's basically armed robbery because they've got guns. And if you resist them, you're going to have a real problem. I once thought I was going to get smarmy with a cop pulling me over with a friend for a seatbelt violation here in Los Angeles. And I just said, hey, what if I don't sign this ticket. Just theoretically, no disrespect, sir. And I was really, really cautious and courteous, but I still thought I was outsmarting him. And he stood back and, he thought about it. He put his hand on his chin. And that was the scary part, because he really was calm and he thought about it. And the window was down about this much, a couple of inches. And he said, well, I guess what I would do is I would reach through that window, drag you through that opening, and I'd lock you up down in Metropolitan Met Jail in downtown LA. And so he was willing to use violence. So that's the source of the problem. We know they're going to use violence on us when they're in our face telling to do something. So it's a very difficult situation. So asset forfeiture is armed robbery. It's theft. It's stealing. It's really bad. And the federal government helps local law enforcement do this armed robbery, because if they're blocked from doing it locally, the feds have a program called equitable sharing, where they actually say, well, just pretend it's not a state law, or just say you're not trying to enforce state law. You're helping the federal government enforce a federal act, and then we'll give you 80% of the proceeds. Well, just by simply passing laws that are directives to stop that in places like New Mexico, Nebraska, Ohio, Colorado, California, and probably somewhere else that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, this has basically cut this back in those locations up to like 70–80%. It is significant. For whatever reason, sometimes, and I know government doesn't follow the rules given to it, but sometimes it causes real problems for them, probably in the short term. Maybe over time they'll find ways to do end runs around it, but at least let's get a foot in the door and show that freedom is better. And I think that's very positive. So we know that sometimes certain directives work on local law enforcement and government agencies. So why not apply that to gun control? Pass a directive to say what you have been doing, helping the ATF, needs to stop. And if they don't stop, at least you have the situation where you can have a state court case. It rallies people to the cause. People believe that government is supposed to follow the rules. So it's bad PR when they don't on something that's passed that's so new, that isn't really up for interpretation from 200 years ago. So it can be a very effective method. Now, mind you, it's not always a winning solution, because as we know, government doesn't follow the rules given to it. So they try to do end runs around this. And in New Mexico, that's an excellent case of it. On asset forfeiture, they were restricted from participating in asset forfeiture, so they found new kind of interpretations of it, and it's taken some back and forth to really cut it off or cut back on it. Basically, they're really hurting their budgets over there by cutting back on the money that they're stealing from people. So short version, words on paper don't enforce themselves. If the Second Amendment, for example, isn't being enforced, just reminding them that the Second Amendment exists isn't going to change the status quo. Adding another mechanism is helpful. It is not a 100% guaranteed solution, but it is very helpful in changing the way that local and state government is doing enforcement to help the federal government. And this is a very powerful way to stop federal violations of your rights. So that would be the first objection. The second one is the Spooner one, that this Constitution is the problem. It's failed to actually do what it's supposed to do, or it's actually caused the problem that we face today. And the founders were actually, this is before Spooner, the founders were actually aware of this kind of argument. And they referred to even the best Constitution as what they called a mere parchment barrier. Here's how Dave Benner covered it in his article called Parchment Barriers, Not Enough to Stop Tyranny. He said, all written contracts, whether constitution or not, are impotent in their ability to bind authorities without some form of enforcement mechanism. Contracts inevitably lose their intrinsic force when they lack teeth. Even still, some of the same individuals that oppose constitutional government have also taken this argument to another level by suggesting that the same document that is powerless to prevent tyranny is somehow magical enough to establish and encourage a treacherous Leviathan government that knows no bounds. Words on paper are words on paper. They may be the most eloquent, they may be the best rules, but without enforcement, words on paper don't enforce themselves. So parchment barriers, as James Madison famously, repeatedly called the Constitution, a mere parchment barrier. This is just a document. These are ideas. And a parchment can be just crushed by a powerful government. So without the public saying, well, you're not following these rules, without a public being educated on what those rules mean, then you're leaving the enforcement of the parchment barrier in the hands of the people who want to destroy it. And that's not a very good plan. And we see how that has turned out today. Brandon makes a good point. Expecting the Constitution to force people to be moral is not only naive, but goes against principle of agency. This is a good point. I'm going to get into this a little bit, I guess kind of obliquely. Americans weren't destined to be wicked, but we chose corruption to creep in. Dan Warsaw, Spooner is an interesting cat for sure. I like a lot of Spooner's writings. If you read some of his older stuff against the Fugitive Slave Act, too, it is really, really sound stuff. I think as far as Spooner goes, he tried to make the constitutional argument for about a decade, maybe longer, against fugitive slavery, against a monopoly on the postal service, and he just got frustrated. And over time, he was basically like, look, man, these people keep ripping me off. They shut down my business. They keep throwing people into bondage. They're a real problem. Obviously, this whole Constitution thing isn't working out because I've been making the constitutional case, and it's very clear, and they just still don't follow it. So that comes from the same mindset. ANCAP, Matt Hugh, I'm glad someone knew the term. I think Spooner, like Matt says, was a magnificent person. He tried to do a lot of great things, and I think a lot of his writing today is very applicable. So we should cover that a little bit more. I want to do, and I talked to Mike Meharry about this maybe a year ago, we should actually do kind of a short handbook on Spooner's constitutional views, which I think were incredibly interesting. He wrote some really, really good stuff. Hi to Will Johnson as well. Let's get a little further into this parchment barrier idea, this idea that words on paper can enforce themselves. They can cause a government to do something or not. Mike Meharry wrote an article on this called "A Parchment Barrier Needs Enforcement." And talking about James Madison, he in Federalist 46, or 48, I always refer to 46, sorry, he described limits on power in constitutions as mere parchment barriers. Here's Madison's quote. Will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the constitution of the government and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? This is the security which appears to have been principally relied on by the compilers of most of the American constitutions. And this is the winning quote here. Experience assures us that the efficacy, the effectiveness of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government. So a parchment barrier is not going to stop the bad guys from doing stuff. Waving the Constitution in the face of politicians, say, you're violating the Constitution, is going to get them a response like, what do you mean by that? Or I don't care, or it's an emergency, or governmental need, or but the terrorists, or people need health care, or they're going to die in the streets, or I don't care, or you're arrested. That's the way government responds. Politicians who want more power don't care if they're not allowed to have more power, as long as they can get away with it. And getting away with it isn't solved by voting the bums out, because the next people gravitate to areas of great power who want great power. People like you and I probably would be disgusted at the idea of being in elected office. We don't want that kind of power. We don't want to be surrounded by a bunch of criminals and murderers and thieves and liars and crooks. We don't want to be around those people. So good people, and I try to be a good person. I don't always win on that, but I try my best. I believe in being a good moral person, even in my areas of greatest failure. I don't want to be in that area. I don't want to be around politicians. I don't even want to be in Washington, D.C. I gave a speech at PorcFest a number of years ago, the 10th anniversary. I was a fill-in for Lou Rockwell, which was not an easy task. And I basically said to people, forget that the 202 area code even exists. You cannot convince it to do what you want. The only way forward is resistance, nullification, defiance of their laws. So Mike goes on, he says, in other words, governments won't adhere to the limits on their own power just because we write them out. And this is the guy, you'd think that the Constitution guy, James Madison, would be like, oh yeah, this Constitution that I put together with some of my friends, it's amazing. You want to limit government? We got it. Just follow what I've come together. But the Constitution guy, the father of the Constitution himself, said this thing that we've put together isn't enough. It's not going to work unless there is an enforcement mechanism. So he continued. He said, the conclusion which I am warranted, and this is Madison again in Federalist 48, which I am warranted in drawing from these observations is that a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. Just writing it out, saying you can do this, you can't do that, you can do this, you can't do that. These are your branches. The Supreme Court's going to protect us. Congress is going to do this. The executive's going to veto. If you just write it out and you don't do anything to stop it when they violate it, and you rely on it to limit itself, if you rely on the federal government to limit the power of the federal government, that includes the federal Congress, the federal president, and the federal courts, you shouldn't be surprised when you have all kinds of power in one hand. The guy who wrote the document, or is credited with it, told us this. It's pretty obvious. He even wrote to Thomas Jefferson and said, repeated violations of these parchment barriers have been committed by overbearing majorities in every state. In Virginia, I've seen the Bill of Rights violated in every instance where it has been opposed to a popular current. So they knew in their own experience that governments would violate the rules given to it, period. Constitutions don't enforce themselves. I keep saying that. Words on paper can't do the job. They also can't cause the problem. I mean, they can make it easier. They can provide political cover when worded poorly. They can provide political cover. But if we understand the real meaning, so education on the meaning of what it's supposed to be, and then, of course, more importantly, education on what needs to be done when they break the rules is even more important. And that takes some backbone. It takes some action. And we've talked about this. I know I cover it all the time, and that is nullification. Nullification takes many forms. It could be civil disobedience. It could be state nullification. It could be business nullification. It could be agorism. It could be people doing business without government approval. It's a great example, of course, I have said for years, is marijuana. You've got people who even before the state of California, through the vote, said you're allowed to do this. There were businesses that were producing this product, farms that were growing it, people that were buying and selling and consuming it and using it before government told them they could do it. Then the state government got on board and said, well, now we're going to help you out. And when you have that combination of individuals, because really we're talking about individual human action, which is the most important part. Because if a state passes a law that says we're going to nullify a gun ban, a federal gun ban on bump stocks, but human beings, individuals, do not go out and buy bump stocks anyways, well, then the federal ban is still in effect in practice. So you need individual human action. And then when the state helps you, or one level of government helps you against the other, it makes it far more effective. And that's really what we're talking about when you need an enforcement mechanism. The enforcement mechanism is not relying on the government to police itself. James Madison, just 2 papers earlier in Federalist 46, gave us the outline of the 4 steps on how to deal with it. primarily using a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union by both individuals and states. And for those of you who are ANCAPs, I do like to cite Hans Hermann Hoppe, who wrote a paper, who gave a speech, which is now a paper at the Mises Institute back in 1997. And he said, how do you fight the modern state? Well, the first step is to work in a local level or a more decentralized level. Well, he said the first step technically was to stop putting time, energy, and resources into nationwide political contests. And then he said work on the local level and stop helping in the enforcement of each and every federal law, because as Hoppe put it, without local enforcement by compliant local authorities, the will of the central government is not much more than hot air. So I hope this was really interesting to you. I really like digging into this. I think Spooner is a really, really interesting figure from the 19th century. He, as an anarchist, he wanted to undermine some centralized power. He was pro-constitution, then anti-constitution. So really interesting stuff. I do think people who are just relying on words on paper to do the job for themselves are making a big mistake, because clearly those words have been on the paper for a couple of centuries now, and they're not doing the job. And to expect government to suddenly just start saying, oh, wow, we were wrong, I guess we should turn things around. We made this mistake. Thank you for letting us know. To me, that is a fool's errand, not Scott Horton's book, but it is a dangerous play, because things aren't going to change on their own. That's why we work to educate individuals and different levels of government that they actually have a role to play in this, and they can do something. And some politicians on a local level, in fact, I think most of them are garbage, but some of them want to make a name for themselves. And the best way to make a name for yourself, sometimes like up in Oakland, is to protect privacy even when Washington, D.C. doesn't want to. So again, I hope you found this interesting. Before we go, I want to run through a couple of quick quotes from two founders that I think really cover this up. James Madison, first of all, said, the states are duty-bound to interpose. Duty. He didn't think it was a good idea for states to do what he called was arrest the progress of evil. He said it's their duty. That's why they exist, is to stop encroachments of our rights from Washington, D.C. And the other one, of course, comes from Thomas Jefferson. He says, where powers are assumed, which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So thank you so much again for watching again. I really appreciate you being here with me today. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you learned something, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. We'll be back here next week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for more Good Morning Liberty at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Have a wonderful weekend and have a great Friday. Thanks again for watching.